Since the very beginning of America's history, it has been lustily eyeing the lands of others around it, eager to expand the nation. The common belief held was the idea of manifest destiny, and that we had a God-given right to expand into the west of America, and that we had a duty to civilize the natives already living there. But when into the mid-1800s America realized it had reached the west coast and had no more land to colonize in North America, it turned its eyes out past mainland America. Frederick Jackson Turner delivered his frontier thesis at the Chicago World Fair in 1893, stating, "Migration to the West has defined us as a nation with each settlement. In such American character, helped define us as a nation of individuals who brought civilization from the frontier. But now we are out of land to migrate to westward." And this embodied the realization America had come to years before by expanding James Polk's original, smaller doctrine into a philosophy that drove Americans' lust for land beyond the reaches of North America.
Recognizing the usefulness of islands and expanding our naval and worldly influence, as these islands could be used as naval bases and refueling stations. This greatly expanded the reach of American ships, and America began to encroach upon the Pacific Islands, not looking back on the turmoil we had caused in the process. In 1863, the Midway Islands were annexed for use as a harbor. Later, in 1893, a group of Americans in Hawaii staged a coup d'etat, overthrowing the Queen.
When Spain started condemning the Cuban people, whom the United States believed to be inferior and incapable of protecting themselves, when some rebelled against the Spanish government, we believed we had to go in and save them, as it was the white man's burden to help protect and civilize natives. One key way to analyze the events taking place and how people felt about them is through the political cartoons of the time. In the picture shown, we can see the Cuban mistress in distress while being fried in a pan of Spanish misrule, over the fire that is the anarchy in Cuba. From this, we can deduce much about the time, namely that there was a rebellion in Cuba and that the Spanish misrule was destroying the Cuban people. The feelings of the author can also be discerned, as they were very anti-Spanish, and that the natives are helpless in their plight and need someone to intervene, which was precisely what the United States did.
Here, we see Uncle Sam carrying the primitive-looking natives to civility on his back, away from the rocks, representing things like oppression and ignorance. This ties back to the idea that it is the burden of the white man, represented by Uncle Sam, to help carry the ignorant natives to safety. It certainly wasn't a coincidence, either, that various newspapers also engaged in yellow journalism, writing sensationalized reports of what was happening to the Cubans in the effort of riling up readers, who then felt even more compelled to want to save them. One main topic they focused on were the actions of General Weyler, who placed the population in concentration camps to ensure they would not rebel. Accusations against his ruthless tactics were so bad he was nicknamed the Butcher.
This feeling of needing to save those weaker than us, paired with the incorrect notion that the U.S. battleship, the USS Maine, was sunk by the Spanish, were important in riling up the Americans' emotions and getting them to support going to war. But there was also a monetary gain involved. Many were also alarmed because American-owned sugarcane fields were being burned by the Spanish in an effort to fight the rebels, causing a loss of property and profits. U.S. citizens also recognized that the benefit of having direct trade with Cuba rather than having Spain as a middleman. Getting rid of Spanish control also allowed for a decrease in Spain's power near the homeland, and could also serve as a site for naval bases and refueling stations.
The war itself was more or less easily won, and through the decisive use of dismounted cavalry troopers, including the African-American 9th and 10th Cavalries and the Rough Riders, commanded by the renowned Theodore Roosevelt, who would earn his name during the war, which would later help him to become president. Decisive battles were fought at San Juan Hill and Santiago in Cuba, which pushed Spanish troops further inland while inflicting thousands of casualties on both sides, while quickly securing Cuba in almost 2 months. These victories, accompanied with the victory at Manila Bay in the Philippines almost a month before, shocked the Spanish into a premature peace, ceding all their land in the Americas to the United States by August of 1898. At this point, they had come closest to achieving their European free New World as the founders of Manifest Destiny had envisioned almost 60 years before. In the end, America gained much of what it had wanted coming in, wealth and land. They now controlled the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and several other islands throughout the Pacific. The Spanish, on the other hand, had been fully pushed out of the New World after maintaining a huge presence there since as early as the 15th century. The Pacific Islands could now serve as both naval and economic bases, which would enable the U.S. to expand their influence across the Pacific Ocean to economic hubs such as India and China, thus enabling them to rival European powers.
America's imperialist lust paid off, and helped set a precedent for other interactions with nations and their natives, given the amount of success they had. The Spanish-American War gave Americans hope for further rising in power, and fueled more efforts aimed at expanding the influence of the growing nation. Directly following the wake of the Spanish-American War, the United States passed the Platt Amendment, which tied the hands of the Cuban people when the United States finally decided to withdraw, so that the United States could maintain indirect control. They also passed the Teller Amendment, which initially told the Cuban people that they were here to help, but had to maintain military presence to ensure their safety. And while they technically had Cuban consent, the Cuban people didn't have much choice. They initially rejected the Platt Amendment in disgust at the terms presented by the Americans, but the Cuban Congress was forced to vote again, and while many chose not to vote, it passed amongst those who chose to. Such renewed efforts also occurred in places like Samoa, where in the Tripartite Convention, the nation was divided up amongst the British, the Germans, and the Americans, entirely without the consent or knowledge of the native people. This put the Americans as equals to the Europeans, both in power and in human rights abuse, as the Europeans had been doing equally questionable acts all around the world for centuries. One does not have to look far to see the link between the European imperialism and the actions of America in the late 19th century. And it is through such a link that one can finally prove America's imperialist nature. And yet it also gave America its pathway to becoming a world power, which today is responsible for the lives of billions around the world. In light of this, the idea of imperialism can be seen in both good and bad ways.
While the day of imperialism would fall into twilight over the course of the next half-century, the actions of both the Americans and of the European powers yields an important lesson on the state of the world today, and it acts as a guiding principle that is, perhaps, to stay as far away from it as possible. There are still many uses of such powers today, and even some residual colonies around the world. So it is up to you, the viewer, to determine whether or not imperialism was right or wrong. Were the actions of the United States justified, morally or financially? Is the abuse of human rights necessary if it leads to the greater good? These are the questions that we, as simple teachers, cannot answer, and it is up to you, the viewer, to decide and act upon that decision to make a better world. Study the lessons of the past, and there you will find your answers.